I want to talk about how Beowulf has a certain amount of continuity with the Exeter book, partially because I want to continue that idea of patterns that we talked about in the very first video. We notice, for example, an elegiac or mournful tone throughout the Exeter book. Well, we find that tone as well in Beowulf, especially with Beowulf's death. There's also that topos that's particular to Old English literature, just like the car crash is particular to our movie making, and that's the exile or wanderer. And you see that at Beowulf's funeral. But often, repeatedly in the path of exile, they shall walk bereft, bowed under woe, now that their leader's laugh is silenced. Another feature, after talking about the wanderer, is the role of the poet. Now, we talked about the wanderer as it related to another elegy in the Exeter book, Dreor. It's clearly an Old English topos. Poetry and poetry making is central to these works. For example, we saw this as well in Cædmon's hymn, in the riddles. You even noticed that the wife's lament begins with an evocation of poetry. Full of sorrow, I shall make this song about me, my own fate. And finally, of course, Wolf and Edwatcher ends with an interesting sententious or moral ending. Men very easily may put asunder that which was never joined or united, our song together. Beowulf is also full of poets and poetry. Did you catch them? For example, Grendel becomes topical news. Sad lays or songs were sung about the beset king, the vicious raids and ravages of Grendel. There's even a singer at Herod. They sang then and played to please the hero, words and music for their warrior prince, harp tunes and tales of adventure. There were high times on the hall benches, and the king's poet performed his part, with the saga of Finn and his sons, unfolding the tale of the fierce attack in Friesland. Beowulf recounts that singer in a narrative. Did you catch that amazing scene, that amazing technique that this author uses? The retelling of a tale from the perspective of one of the characters? There was singing and excitement. An old reciter, a carrier of stories, recalled the early days. At times, some hero made the timbered harp tremble with sweetness or related true and tragic happenings. At times, the king gave the proper turn to some fantastic tale, or a battle-scarred veteran, bowed with age, would begin to remember the martial deeds of his youth and prime and be overcome as the past welled up in his wintry heart. Beowulf is also the topic of song. Meanwhile, a thane of the king's household, a carrier of tales, a traditional singer deeply schooled in the lore of the past, linked a new theme to a strict meter. The man started to recite with skill, rehearsing Beowulf's triumphs and feats in well-fashioned lines, entwining his words. He told what he'd heard, repeated in song about Sigmund's exploits. Literally, the singer word otherfand. That means found new words. And that finding is a medieval notion, it's a rhetorical notion actually, of composition. Finding is inventio. And inventio is that sort of brainstorming where you're looking for material and you're shaping that material in order to tell a tale or tell a poem. Cædmon's hymn's all about that, remember? They found material, they gave it to Cædmon, and Cædmon shaped it into a poem. Word otherfond, found new words, sotha yebunden, and bound them truly. And how do you bind these words once you've found them? Well, you know already now. through alliteration, right? That's the meter. Notice also that he says that he told what he had heard. That puts the book into a larger narrative matrix of storytelling. It takes the tale and puts it into a network of other tales. So, the Spear Danes in days gone by, that's the past, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. This telling is likewise based on older material, older sources. But this is a new song bound in meter, but based on something old turned into something new. That explains perhaps the strange conflict we also see between the pagan and the Christian elements that are hard to shake in Beowulf. Not just in the word word that we talked about in the last episode, that pagan fate versus the Latin Christian fortune. Sometimes at pagan shrines, they vowed offering to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid. He's talking about the devil, right? So this is a negative portrayal of the gods. And save the people. That was their way. Their heathenish hope, right? That's their pagan hopes, their incorrect hope. But deep in their hearts, they remembered hell. The almighty judge of good deeds and bad, the Lord God, head of the heavens and high king of the world, was unknown to them. But he was still, the Christian notions are still lodged deep in their hearts. They remember it. He's interpreting the old material in a new way. And that line, deep in their hearts, they remembered hell. That's Neoplatonic thinking, right? That's cutting edge medieval theology. They know, but they have forgotten. Do you remember this idea from Plato? The ideals are deep within you, and it takes you hard work, Socrates shows, in order to access what you already know. It's an idea we also find in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. In the Consolation of Philosophy, Lady Philosophy reminds Boethius that he knows things, but he has forgotten them. The same idea applies here. The pagan past is being evoked in the story, but the Christian present is waiting to happen. If we go back to the Thane's song, we also notice something interesting. We're talking about the Thane here of the king's household who told a tale linked to the past in a strict meter, and he told of what he'd heard, the story about Sigmund's exploits, and then we get Sigmund's stories, the one that runs across here. This is all about Sigmund. If we think about the larger idea of how Beowulf is structured, then we have a poet, our narrator, singing an old Scandinavian song about the Danes and the Geats, but in the old English language. And in that song, there are further songs, songs within songs. For example, the story of Sigmund, as well as the story of Finn. They sang then and played to please the hero, words and music for their warrior prince, harp tunes and tales of adventure. There were high times on the hall benches, and the king's poet you remember this passage. And then, suddenly, we have the song. Hildebert had little cause to credit the Jutes. And there's a sort of paraphrase that follows. She, the woman in shock, waylaid by grief, Hawk's daughter, how could she not lament her fate? At some point, the poet's paraphrase turns into the song itself. And that happens somewhere around line 1079. And then at this point, and so farewell, the song kicks in. I also want to point out that I do not like this term saga. It's an Old Norse intrusion into Beowulf, and it's not there in the text itself. But these songs, after Beowulf defeats Grendel, even lead to the poet allowing his character to give his perspective of the events. It happens when he tells his lord. We saw this passage previously. Beowulf is now explaining that there was singing and excitement, right? There's an old reciter, a carrier of tales. So the poem is built around poems. And we're recognizing a topos that will travel throughout medieval literature, books and poems, where the poet who's writing the text, his figure as the writer becomes front and center to the experience of the text itself. You're going to find references to poets and to poetry throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance period. So look for those when you're reading it. Now I want to focus on one song that goes to the heart of this text and helps explain why the monsters appear. It's at Grendel's funeral, after he's killed the dragon and died. A Geat woman, too, sang out in grief. With hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament, her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. What is she afraid of? Revenge. As Wiglaf explains to the cowards or battle dodgers after Beowulf's death. Now war is looming over our nation. Soon it will be known to Franks and Frisians far and wide that the king is gone. Hostility has been great among the Franks, those are the French, since Hygelac sailed forth at the head of a war fleet into Friesland, where the Hetwer harried and attacked and overwhelmed him with great odds. The leader in his war gear was laid low, fell among followers. That lord did not favor his company with spoils. In other words, he was not generous. He didn't share the booty, basically what they had gained in battle. The Merovingian king, that's the French, has been an enemy to us ever since. Nor do I expect peace or pact keeping of any sort from the Swedes. You're given a list of enemies ready to pounce. Her fear and his fear point to human monsters, to us, and to the beginning of the book, back to Hrothgar's Hall and the first appearance of Grendel. Now, Beowulf has always been an enigma to me. Why do the monsters come? And also, how do they relate to Hrothgar's Hall? I could never figure that part out, and I hope you also were struck by that enigmatic element in Beowulf, because as we've learned already, that enigmas are essential to the Old English literature. The riddles found in the Exeter book are also what makes the narrative, in each narrative, a riddle. And so the riddle in Beowulf was, how do the monsters connect to the hall? Why does the hall produce monsters? So the natural starting place will be to look at the hall. And we'll do that in the next episode when we take a closer look at the monsters.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.